somebody recently shared in the Discord an article by Richard Garfield about the differences between tournament and ladder play.
Who's Richard Garfield?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I don't know. He's just a guy. Writes about games.
Probably not important.
Yeah.
Distraction makers.
The article is called "Keep Your Numbers Off of Me: Why Tournaments Support Better Communities Than Ladders."
He may be a bit biased here.
Probably.
Yeah.
But we wanted to talk about the article, go through some of the points that he brings up.
Really looking forward, it's not so much about, we should go back to tournaments as much as it's like, okay, if this is the reaction that people have from ladders, then what can we learn from both and how can we change ladders moving forward?
Right. How can we make a better system for playing online? And what are some of the sort of negative outcomes of ladders? The way that I sort of think about it is that a tournament is more like a sprint and a ladder is more like a marathon, right? Where a tournament is usually handled over the course of a day or a couple days if they're a really high level event, and the focus of the player is just on winning that tournament, right? Like you're not worried about necessarily the larger ecosystem of competitive play.
Now, a pile of those though eventually will lead to
sure. Whereas ladder play is sort of an online ranking system that happens in perpetuity. You're playing, you're receiving rank for playing, or you're losing rank for losing, and it's a constant fluctuation of moving between particular buckets of players. Usually we see this as bronze, silver, gold, platinum, diamond, master, whatever.
Which I feel like there are maybe sports or some games that have tournaments that kind of have this sort of ladder-ish system where you're constantly kind of going up and down over the course of the tournament, but it's still a much smaller chunk. It's not over the course of a whole season, right?
It's more like a league.
I think the biggest point, and I remember feeling this a lot as a young Yu-Gi-Oh player, was going into a tournament and not knowing how good anyone is. So you could go against any one opponent, and I have no idea if they are better or worse than I am. You get a sense of it in trading card games because they look like they own more expensive cards than I do.
Sure, yeah.
Right? They have a really thick binder. I don't have that. So you kind of have these like indicators, but you really don't know what their rankings are. And also they could have all those things and still be bad at the game. I
do remember early days of Magic tournaments when I would show up and you'd play against the person that had all foils in their deck or something, and you're like, I'm in trouble. Like, and then, even though like later on you realize that they're not that good. They're just there to chat or something. They just spent a lot of money. Yeah.
Early Vorthos before there was a name for it.
Sure. Yeah. But I do think that in tournament play, you show up to the tournament. It's a community setting. You don't necessarily know which player is necessarily better. You can get vibes, but there's nothing like concrete, right? So in that scenario, the thing that is sort of being communicated to the player as what is most important in that moment is I guess the games themselves, right? That day, it kind of comes back to what I was saying before, where I'm seeing tournaments more as a sprint, right? It's almost an enclosed ecosystem of I'm going to play games, I'm going to be ranked across the tournament, but then all that stuff just kind of fades away theoretically at the end of the tournament. Yeah. Where in ranked play, you're associated with your rank in perpetuity. So what that system is then sort of putting players' attention on is I'm focused entirely on what my rank is rather than potentially even the game itself, right? And we see some of this come out in min-maxing that some players end up doing where they'll adopt particular strategies that are advantageous to moving through the ranks faster. This is mono red in Magic Arena most famously, but also we can see this kind of stuff in StarCraft, like Zergling rushes.
What's interesting too about tournaments is that you can't switch your deck out. So like you can sideboard, but I think it's really interesting that it goes in line with your sprint idea is that when you show up, that's just the deck you're showing up with. So you have to have a good understanding generally of what the meta is going to be or where you stand in it, right? Are you going to bring a deck that's going to counter what's currently in the meta, or are you going to be bringing the tried and true, whatever is maybe top tier at that moment?
My experience with Magic, having played tournament Magic for 20-ish years, was that it was sort of a weekly cycle, right? Where the weekends would be the tournaments, and then throughout the week is when you're playtesting and honing and changing your deck, and then playing again the next weekend. And I think you bring up a very good point in that it's a snapshot, right? You have to choose what strategy you'll be bringing to that tournament, and the tournament is when that stuff matters. Right. But the time in between, there's all kinds of room for innovation, right? All thinking and changing and trying to predict what other people are going to lock in as their tournament strategy. But once it's locked in, it is for the remainder of that tournament. Where in ladder play, there's a constant flux of, okay, well, I can fine tune and change strategies constantly and get data back immediately about how well those changes are doing. And I can continue to hone my deck all the way up through the rankings, and then also hone the strategy that is most efficient at climbing ranks.
And this happens, I mean, it goes in line somewhat with, we talked a little bit about sort of how metas are just being solved at this like rapid pace that no one seems to have a great solve for other than just accepting their fate. But and I think it goes right in line with that, where it's like anyone could just go on MTG Goldfish and be tracking all the littlest changes that are happening to the top decks as they're working their way up into the rankings. It's just interesting considering how ranking is going to change people's perception of other players. I've done jiu-jitsu for a couple of years. And there's no-gi jiu-jitsu, and then there's gi jiu-jitsu, where you wear the whole, white outfit with the belt and all that. No-gi, you don't see rankings. And so you go in and you're going to start wrestling someone. You have no idea if they're good. Obviously, you get a sense for it once you start wrestling them and stuff like that. But it creates this really interesting environment where, like, it's probably similar when you go into a card store, and you're going to go up against someone, you're like, all right, like... Yeah. How good are you?
And it depends on your perception, right? Like you might not understand some of that, some of those aesthetics of what a better player might present as, but
right. But there is this social shift that happens when you do see someone's rank, when it is visible for everyone. And so when you go and you roll against someone that's like, let's say you're a white belt and you go against a purple belt or something like that, there's this immediate understanding of like, well, I'm going to lose. Like, I'm not going to win against this person. And on top of that, it shifts your goal, and that your goal at that point is no longer even to win. Instead, you're going to be trying to learn from the person. And this is something that the article touches on that's really interesting, which is that it's really encouraging of tournament play, in particular playing against people that are clearly better than you, so that as a player, you can learn from the better players, basically.
I do wonder if this is something that does not translate to digital all that well. Because if you're in a digital environment and you're not sort of part of the community and seeing somebody maybe multiple times, there's no incentive for somebody in a digital game to, or even really a way for them to explain things to you, right? There's no slowdown. There's no like, oh, well, if you would just like, you could tap this differently and get this effect, or let me do that. And like in a casual tournament context, like Friday Night Magic, that would happen a lot. Right. Is that you would not necessarily go easy on somebody, but you would help guide them a bit, right, to a better outcome potentially. Where in digital environment, like you're just going to stop the person and move on, right? Like there's a games per hour motive kind of, right, where that doesn't exist in a tournament because there's only so many games that are going to be played in that tournament at all. And I do wonder about, like, specifically for you in terms of like seeing the rank versus not seeing the rank in jiu-jitsu. I think in a physical space, was it demoralizing? Like,
no, it's the exact opposite. It's like when you see someone, you go against them, you're like, whoa, they're so good. How do you get that good? Yeah. And then you want to talk to them, you want to ask them questions, and you try different moves on them and stuff like that. And it does create this really great sense of community and learning. And
it's tough to say, like, how easy is it to facilitate that kind of environment in a digital setting anyway? And it feels like what's been accepted as the norm is that it's not worth pursuing, right? We're just developing these ranked ladders. Ladder play ends up having a 50% like win percentage. It's trying to funnel players to a 50% win percentage. And because it's doing that, there's a homogenization in experience, right? Where players are winning as often as they're losing, theoretically, once they reach their sort of logical conclusion of rank.
I think that's the key takeaway here, is that like when you see ranks, and the article kind of mentions this a little bit too, is that like what would often happen in a lot of these online rankings is that like if you were a bronze player and you can see that your opponent's gold, then the bronze player sometimes would just be like, whoa, I'm out of here. Like they're not going to bother playing because they are associating that ranking with a win percentage, which makes sense. But like you're saying, the logic is not so much that they are actually a better player as much as they are a player that has played a lot more games. They could be a significantly worse player, but they just played enough to average out the percentages to work their way up the ladder in that way.
Our most important part of a game is uncertainty, right? You if there is certainty, then the game is exhausted and there's no real reason to play it.
Even made up certainty, right?
Right. Even perceived certainty. Yeah, and I do think that the ladder play in this way is contributing to perceived certainty.
Again, it kind of falls back somewhat on this sort of like social structure and like what makes a trading card game really like exciting. And once let's say you remove the collecting of it, well then okay, it's just you making the best deck possible, so it's about meta solving and then maybe playing out the meta in that way, so hopefully that's exciting. But then if it's also online and you're not talking to the people, then it's essentially just a practice in replicating, like the way it's going is basically people are solving the meta very fast, people are picking up the meta decks, they're going to play the meta decks for a carrot on a stick that is a reward on a ladder so that they feel good because they're a high rank, but they don't actually know if they're that good of a player or not. And it seems like it's more of like a pattern or a process and less of like an engaging community or game.
To come back to Richard Garfield's article, which we'll link in the description, so you can read it over. I do think some of his thoughts are pertinent here in terms of, we have another video that was about sort of the content creator metagame, but I think that that ladder play specifically is also contributing to this lack of turnover within a metagame. And I do think the thing that we're hitting on here is that locking in moment of, I'm locking in a strategy for this tournament, and then that will then get changed and iterated on throughout a period of time until I lock it in again for the next tournament.
It's tough to say though, because that could just also be viewed as this sort of artificial like extension of time, right?
Sure.
But also if these quick additions and quick adjustments of a deck, like we've seen, tend to lean towards more aggressive decks, at least in best of one ranked arena and stuff like that. That's a whole other thing. But yeah, I think all these small, quick iterations as you're working your way up the ladder, whereas previously if you locked in your deck and you had to go to the tournament and stuff like that, it just sort of extended that time that you would actually get to see the actual results when paired with that tournament. And it's very possible that during that week that you were prepping and you were researching and you were practicing and goldfishing and stuff, that someone else was doing that with a different deck that ends up completely countering your deck. And then it just keeps it fresh, right? But when everything's constantly going and you can constantly get that data, I think it just ends up being that homogenized thing like we're saying.
Yeah. There's a lack of uncertainty, not only in the matchups when a system is pointed to 50-50, it's also that the continued iteration cycle that happens across the ladder is homogenizing play experience for the best decks to most efficiently move through that system.
Right. And the worst thing is that when it ends up being this sort of 50-50 circumstances, again, this is mostly a problem in best of one and not best of three. When it's a 50-50 play experience, that what ends up happening is that you get more people that end up basically throwing matches or conceding early because they end up seeing whatever type of deck they're going against in a particular meta, and they're like, well, that deck's just really good against my deck, so concede.
I'm probably not going to win anyway. I'm just going to go ahead and concede and then take the loss and move back into...
And then you get 2 or 3 games without that deck that you end up winning, moving up the rank, and then you run into it again, and so you concede. And it just sort of, again, it creates... it's a process. It's not really necessarily like playing...
You're playing the ladder. You're not playing the game.
Playing the ladder.
Well, thanks for watching our talk about tournaments versus ladders. Make sure to check out Richard Garfield's article in the description below. Also, if you like our videos here, you can like and subscribe. If you want to talk any more about the stuff we talk about here, you can join our Discord. The link is also in the description below. Thanks for watching. Pew, pew, pew. We'll see you next time.
You know it.